why we say here in the modern day that companies like Lodsys are trolls all the way. Patent trolls extort large companies and tiny, and when you call them trolls, they're offended and all whiny. They get all kinds of whiny.
Hello, and welcome to the Tech Dirt Podcast. I'm Mike Masnick. Over the last few weeks, we've had a variety of guest participants talking about their own areas of focus, which has been really great. But this week, we're back to our original crew of Hirsch Reddy and Dennis Yang. Hirsch hasn't been able to make the podcast in a while, so we're happy that you're back.
Yay.
And so today and next week, we're actually going to focus on one of Hirsch's own areas of focus, which are patents. Obviously, patents and the patent system have been a big area of focus on TechDirt for many years. And over the last few months, every other week or so, I'd get a text message from Hirsch saying, "Hey, I think it's time to do a podcast on patents."
You make me sound so eager.
You are. And I agree. And so who better to talk about it than you, Hirsch, who has a computer science degree, worked in the tech industry for many years before going back to law school and becoming a dreaded patent attorney, something I warned you against doing. Between us, we have a lot of opinions about patents, and so we're going to turn this one into a two-parter, hopefully. We'll see how this goes. But this week, we're going to try and discuss what we see as the problems of the patent system. And next week, we'll try and dig into some potential solutions, though we'll see. I figure some of the solution stuff will probably drag into this week, and some of the problems will probably show up in next week's. Since I know that Hirsch is already eager to speak his mind on this subject, I'll keep the intro short. But in my experience, the patent system is based on a premise that is fundamentally flawed. And that is that the incentives to innovate are monopoly control over an invention, which will allow the inventor to recoup the cost of research. If you look at the history of innovation, however, it simply does not support this theory. Innovation tends to be driven by a combination of need and the general desire to build something better. And the incentive for greater innovation seems to often come from competition rather than monopoly control. And thus, it seems like the patent system is often directly counterproductive to advancing innovation. Competition is what lets innovators experiment and continue to improve on good ideas, providing whatever will best serve the market. The patent system, however, gets in the way of that and says that most participants can't actually build the best possible product because they're legally blocked from doing so, or they can only do so while paying a ridiculously high price, if that's even on the table. The end result is toll booths that hinder innovation rather than competition that enables it. On top of this, some structural problems with the patent system today has given rise to a whole class of companies, and I hesitate to even use the word companies to describe them, known as patent trolls, that really use the system as a form of extortion. Though I'd argue that the problems of the patent system go beyond just trolls to practicing entities as well, using the system as a way to block competition in a manner that harms the public and the wider innovation economy. So Hirsch, have at it. What do you think is wrong with the patent system today, in your view?
That is an expansive question. Wow. All right. So where to start?
Remember, we have two weeks to do this.
All right. So don't try to cram everything into my first 5 minutes. Okay. Got it. So you basically, you covered all the, the basics of patents, right? The reason we have patents is because we are trying to encourage some sort of research or development that wouldn't occur without the patent, right? That's the basic logic.
I mean, the official logic in the Constitution is to promote the progress of the useful arts.
And I think the arguments you gave against that are sometimes counterintuitive to people, right? Because most people feel this intuition that, hey, it goes all the way back to, let's say, our high school or grade school, where someone does all the work for the homework, and if the neighbor can just copy their homework, that's not really fair, right? And it seems intuitive also because we see those kinds of representations of inventors in movies where they're working in their garage. They invent what was that movie where he invents a new type of wiper,
the windshield wiper. I forget what the movie is called,
and then all the major manufacturers,
is somewhat loosely based on a true story, but a very exaggerated one.
Right. So there's certainly these tales, and here's the thing though. Like I think we are all familiar with different areas of kind of technology, right? And we happen to be sitting in Silicon Valley, and me and Dennis both, we work in software, and perhaps in software, patents have sort of the least justification, right? There might be so. If we talk about patents in the context of software, kind of the arguments against patents are much more easy to make.
Sure.
It would probably be a more difficult and more nuanced conversation if we were talking about something like pharmaceuticals, right? So some of the things that I'm going to say really apply to software, and some of the things we all are going to be talking about really apply to software.
And it should be noted, just as a quick historical note, and we could go into a lot more detail on this, which is that for many, many years, until very, very recently, most people considered that software was not actually patentable.
Yep.
And then there were sort of a series of cases, mostly leading up in the late 90s, that sort of flipped that over, which created a whole other set of problems beyond just the question of whether or not software should be patentable, but the fact that after 1998, suddenly the doors were flung open to say that software was patentable. Exactly. And then because of the way the Patent Office itself judges patents and whether or not something is patentable subject matter and whether or not there's prior art, they will only realistically look at other patents, existing patents, or journal articles, published journal articles. And yet, because most people and most in the software industry didn't think that software was patentable at all, there wasn't, decades of prior art that the patent office would look at, because they were actually forbidden from doing internet searches for a variety of reasons. And so you created this huge opportunity for people to patent anything.
And if you think about sort of the most innovative and valuable software companies of the early 90s, I'm not going to talk about the late 90s, but the early 90s, like Microsoft and some of the other database companies, some companies that are not around anymore. If you think about just what Bill Gates used to say about software patents, right? When they were starting off, before Microsoft became the patenting powerhouse that they are today, when Bill Gates was talking about software patents initially, he said, look, if you give people the permission to take ownership of all these different software algorithms, essentially, then what's going to happen is some people are just going to spend time doing those patents, and they're going to go after us. And so seeing this, Microsoft, we are going to get into the game of getting these patents and suing other people. And that's precisely what they did. And now if you ask Bill Gates or another Microsoft executive about the patent system, they're going to be very quiet. They're going to be very supportive of it because now they have that arsenal, whereas before they didn't. Yeah. So really, when they were on their rise up, they didn't need patents.
And in fact, I mean, if you look at Bill Gates' quotes, he actually said, if people had believed that software was patentable in the early days of Microsoft, that the entire industry would have developed differently, and it wouldn't have developed as dynamic, But now, this is now 5 or 6 years ago, I actually got called in to meet with Microsoft's head of patents, patent licensing, and it was the most bizarre conversation in which we just went back and forth, and he tried to convince me that licensing patents, Microsoft's licensing program was really good for innovation, and there was like a complete disconnect.
Yeah. Well, we'll get back to what that disconnect is specifically, but coming back to this idea that you need to protect things with patents, right? Think about the most valuable companies around us now in Silicon Valley, the Facebooks, the Twitters, right? Neither Facebook or Twitter, when they were rising and getting to their big valuations, were actually out there aggressively patenting. It was only after they kind of hit the road, had the rubber burning, that they went out there and said, oh my God, we don't have any patents, we have to go get them. But when they were actually growing their audience and getting the investment and actually getting that explosive growth, they didn't have patents and they weren't asserting patents against anyone. And the same goes for Google. Actually, to this day, has Google ever aggressively asserted a patent against?
Only once. And so for years, I point out the fact that they never went on the offensive and asserted a patent against anyone else. The one time they did was actually not well, it depends on what you consider technically. It was Motorola, which, for a brief period of time, Google owned Motorola. They've since sold it off. And Motorola offensively asserted some patents. And I was actually, when that happened, I wrote about it. And I said, this is a big shift because Google has never been on the offensive on patents. But that's the only case where they've done so.
And who did they assert it against?
I can't remember now.
Was it a big or a small entity? Do you remember that?
I'm pretty sure it was a big entity.
Yeah. So, I mean, we basically get into this state where you think about how patents are used. And so clearly with big companies and companies that are already, on the road to success, they don't really play that much of a role, it seems. But the argument that people will make, and specifically patent attorneys will make this, right, is, I guess patent attorneys other than me, but patent attorneys will make this argument that, hey, we need these software patents because if we don't have them, a small guy sitting in his mom's basement writing software will make this great system like a Facebook. And somebody else like a Microsoft will take that idea and clone it and make another Facebook, right? But we can see in the real world, right? Yeah. Like how many times do we actually see that? It's like, first of all, a big company like Microsoft or even Google today. Google used to be considered very, on the ball, right? Google has tried to make their own Facebook, Google+. They have huge amounts of resources they put behind that. Why weren't they able to do that when Facebook was smaller? It's not a trivial problem. And part of the things that protect your software product are intangible things like your team, the expertise within your team, and things like that. And those things are not very intuitive to the layman, right?
And I mean, they're not even intuitive to the experts. And this is the amazing thing. One quick footnote, because I looked it up while you were just talking. It was Apple that Motorola.
Okay, see, that kind of makes sense.
So, yeah. But, and this is the amazing thing. People who don't spend time actually innovating, and by innovating, I don't mean just inventing something new, but actually coming up with products that people want, is how people who don't do that don't recognize how little of the sort of public, tangible aspects, the idea behind the product is what makes it successful. It's always the little sort of intangible things. And so it's easy to take a product that you see is super successful and make an exact replica of it. But actually getting people to buy into that is very, very difficult because there's all sorts of little intangible things that make it work. And so, right, I mean, Microsoft, when Microsoft decided to get big time into search, they were much bigger than Google and had many more resources, and they invested heavily. And, according to many, the search product, very quickly became just as good as Google's, and yet people didn't use it. And none of this had to do with patents or this sort of, we know what the sort of explicit aspects of what a good search engine are, but that doesn't make it one that people will actually want to use.
Well, one way you can sort of judge the valuableness of this sort of the critical patents of Google is the fact that they went around after they had that PageRank patent and tried to get acquired, and everybody turned them down.
Yeah.
Right? There was very modest purchase prices that they were offering, right? It was like less than $10 million at some point. They were offering themselves up for sale, and nobody jumped on that. It wasn't like just the idea alone was valuable, right? But let's jump back onto this thing, which is like, look, the real crux of the matter, the real justification boils down to every time this sense that we have the patent system to prevent this case of like really terrible unfairness. And what is that terrible unfairness? It is the hardworking inventor screwed by the greedy Scrooge billionaire who steals the idea, right? That is really the thing. So if you think about it from that point of view, we could all sit here and be like, yeah, I actually, as a society, we want to prevent that from happening. But what costs are we willing to bear to prevent that harm from happening? And how often does that harm happen? Because that would sort of inform, your tolerance for how high you would want the effort or regulation burden to be in order to prevent that harm. To give you kind of an analogy, like what's another kind of harm that happens very much now in the technological world is, let's say, something like bullying. right? Online and offline bullying. And there's often tragedies associated with bullying, right? Like people commit suicide, they're scarred for life, etc. We can all get behind stopping bullying. Now imagine we as a society said we want to have absolutely no bullying at all, right? Like what kind of regulations could we dream up? We would dream up regulations where we'd be like, oh, let's make it so that everything a kid says anytime is recorded and can be reviewed by a committee to see if he was bullying someone. We could say that. Let's forget about sort of the privacy implications of that because that's not really relevant to my analogy. But let's just imagine that we say we're gonna have the situation where we're gonna record everything a kid says in high school and we're gonna examine it for bullying. And then we have anytime somebody feels like they're getting bullied, they could have your recording pulled in front of a committee, and that committee is gonna decide whether you're bullying or not.
Right.
Imagine how much that would suppress people's ability to just express themselves.
Yep.
Imagine how many false accusations would happen because minus the context, things could be misinterpreted. Imagine the cost of having to have these committees, recording devices, and all these things. And you would think to yourself, if we had that system in place, backing out of that system would be nearly impossible because everyone would say, oh my God, my kid could get bullied if the system was reversed, right? I feel like this is what the patent system is like. We feel like if we back out of this crazy system we have, things are going to get stolen.
Yeah.
People are going to suffer. But if we were really starting today and saying, do we need to introduce a patent system? If we had a software industry that didn't have a patent system, we would really struggle to kind of justify the huge regulatory burden that this system actually is for like startups and companies. And I think looking at it from that perspective, it's something that people don't do enough.
Yeah, and one thing that you brought up that point that that people sort of recognize that there's they think of the case the sort of fairness case, right, where somebody invents something great and somebody else just copies it and runs off with all the work. And so there are 2 points that I think are really interesting about that. One is that we know that almost never happens with the patent system today because, and you can tell, because under today's patent laws, if you can show willful infringement, which is, doesn't necessarily mean took the idea and directly copied it, but someone who did take the idea and directly copy it, that would include willful infringement, that will give you triple damages, right? And so therefore, in cases where that's happening, it always makes sense for the plaintiff to argue that there was willful infringement and to make the case that they copied it. And yet, it's very, very rare that in
I
cases,
can't think of a single case.
And there is a study, and I'm sort of trying to look it up as I speak, which makes it difficult. But there was a study that showed I forget what it is, but it's a tiny, tiny percentage of patent cases actually involve a claim of willful infringement.
And you know what that indicates, right? That means that people, when you have patented something, they are independently inventing the same patented thing. And that's something that I think most laymen don't realize about our patent system, is if I go and patent something that I made in my bedroom, and then you went in your bedroom and invented it completely independent from me, I can still sue you.
Yep. And so that gets to the second point, which is exactly along those lines, which is, one of the things that I bring up is people say, people who haven't experienced this aspect of the patent system, they look at it and they say, well, isn't it unfair for that person who did all that research to then suddenly have to face competition? But let's bring up the other point, the real point. The way this really works is that, if someone is working on a particular project, it's likely that 5 or 10 or however many other companies are working on that same project. So let's just take the 3 of us around this table, right? And each of us are working on some big new invention, and we're each tinkering away in our garage, if we're going to go with the sort of independent garage inventor concept. And it just so happens, Hirsch, that you figure it out a week before Dennis and I. And so you rush to the patent office and you get that patent.
And let's just assume my solution isn't as good, by the way.
Right. Well, we'll get there, right? But first, let's assume that the solution is equal, right? Now, all 3 of us spent, whatever, let's say a year just doing all this research and putting all this effort in. And yet, so the argument that, well, you deserve that patent because you put in all that effort doesn't make sense in this situation, which is the much more realistic scenario. Because now, even though I and Dennis also put in all that work and research, now not only do we not get the monopoly for doing that work, we can't even make use of our own completely independent work.
Yep.
Because you have the patent and can block us from doing so. And then you take it to that next level, which is the other point that you brought up, and you say, well, what if the solution that I came up with is better? What if the solution that Dennis came up with is even better than that? That doesn't matter. We're completely blocked from doing it because you hold the patent and can completely block it.
And actually, let's track back on one of the things you said. Let's imagine we worked a year on that patent law. Look, I've been working as a patent attorney for this many years, right? Honestly, most of the stuff that gets patented in software patents is not stuff that people worked on for a year, right?
It's not even stuff that people worked on.
Yeah, a lot of times it's just like people come up with an idea over lunch or maybe over a week.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of times people don't realize this. A business team sits together and goes like, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool to do this?" And it's a very high level thing, like imagine we have a juice machine and you can order stuff on it, using a mobile phone, and then if the juice machine doesn't have the juice you want, a truck is told to bring the juice to the machine or something like that, right? And you'd be like, oh, but isn't that just common sense? No, but you could actually write a patent like that, and I'm pretty sure you could get to the patent. It probably doesn't exist, and someone out there, go ahead and patent it. I mean, you'd have to cite me as an inventor, but you know what I mean? That's the kind of stuff that people are patenting and getting away with. And the thing about it is, people just assume that because it has this word patent on it, that it was a bunch of guys sweating in a laboratory with these white coats, these chemistry goggles on, and just wiping the sweat of their brow. It's not like that. It's in fact, I might get in trouble talking too much about this, but I've worked with some pretty big clients where the patenting system, the way it works is you go into a room, 4 or 5 engineers show up, and everyone just starts shooting out these ideas on stuff that they were already working on for a couple of years and be like, oh, should we do a patent on this? Oh, sure, maybe. How about this one? And they just start throwing out stuff that they didn't invent to do a patent, that there wasn't some kind of big research project to do. It was just hey, dude, this guy's working on this website. Is there anything we can patent here?
And it's worth pointing out, there is no requirement to actually make a working version of what you're trying to patent. You can just
there
patent.
used to be though, right?
In the early days, but it's been a long time since that's been in place. And so you can patent things that are impossible. You can patent a time machine, right?
Right. But I think that's part of. One of the things that I think it's maybe societal or cultural is since we're very young, you would think of something, and I remember being a kid and being like, that's a great idea, you should patent it. Right. I think that that's this idea of a patent, this idea of an idea ownership thing, has been around since for a long, long time, and I think that's kind of. I don't actually disagree with you that people think that people work long and hard on patents. Mm-hmm. I think that there's this concept of a gold rush mentality towards thinking of an idea, right? Mm-hmm. Where if you're the so-called first person to think of an idea, you deserve something, and I think that's. I don't know where that comes from. Is that is it an American thing? Is it
I think
this idea that the idea man is the most important guy in the organization, and all these idiots just slogging and doing it don't really.
It's part of that. One is that people certainly overestimate the value of the idea versus the execution, and I think that's a big part of it. But I think there's something else that Dennis is getting at, which is important, which is that there is this sort of expectation that that whoever comes up with any idea deserves some sort of ownership claim over it. And that's not just in the patent space. We see that certainly in copyright and trademark and other areas of intellectual property as well.
But I think that sting is it's something very human about it, right? If you we always see companies you're like, oh man, I thought of that a year ago, 10 years ago. Yeah. Remember when we talked about that? And I think that kind of sting is very real, and the patent system kind of speaks to that. So how do we?
There's an emotional connection to it, and I think that's definitely true. And I think and I do wonder how much of that is just sort of a natural reaction versus how much of that is sort of been brainwashed into people because we've just been hearing the same independent inventor.
Yep. Exactly.
Argument over and over again.
It's not brainwashing in America today because you actually can go and sue people if you have a patent. So it's perfectly rational for me as a lawyer to tell my client that, hey, this is what you can do. Because my clients have to live with the patent system that exists, not the one that I wished would exist, right? Right. So that's why, to some extent, I owe my employability to the fact that the system is so broken, right? Why would people come and hire me in Silicon Valley?
Are there businesses that just sit around and think about when new technology is invented?
Yep.
Right.
Totally. Totally.
that's a great technology. You could do this, and they just start writing patents. Left
Yeah, and
right.
in fact, it goes even further than that. We actually just had an article about this, which is this company that is coming out there. I don't know if you saw this, but they're taking patents. So if you come up with an idea and you write a patent, they will then they have an algorithm that will take the patent that you write and then basically substitute in other words to try and create more patents that will cover similar ideas and areas, and they're automating the patent.
Is that patented as well?
Okay, it would not surprise me. It must be.
The thing is, this system is already at a state of absurdity, and
Yeah.
the only people who argue that it's not absurd are literally the patent lawyers, right? Like the venture
Except you.
capitalists.
Yeah.
Well, well, I guess if I place myself, I guess I am a patent lawyer.
You are.
But it's basically the only people who argue that it's not are the patent judges, the patent lawyers, the assertion entities, like
Right.
the VCs.
Right, the people who directly benefit from the existing system.
I mean, is it worth to bring up pharma at this point? I mean, pharma seems to be different.
I don't
for
want to
some
muddy the
reason.
water with pharma, because even though we can make an argument against even pharma patents, it's much more nuanced and it's much more on the
So
borderline.
let's actually,
much harder.
but it's actually a really interesting discussion. It's one that I like having, because there are people who do like to say, well, okay, patents make sense in pharma, and I actually question that, but I think that's a big discussion, and so maybe we'll do another podcast on that down the road.
Yeah.
I don't know about it.
Yeah, that sounds
Immediately,
great.
but let's do that. Let's do that eventually. But yeah, that's that's a whole other.
I mean, it's much clearer with software, just because, I mean, for software patents, at least there's data to show, right? There's data to show, how absurd it's gotten. One of the clear things that I can talk about in this, just having been a patent attorney and being paid to do this stuff, is one of the when startups come to me, a lot of times the founders have no interest in filing patents. They come to me with for patent advice, and the patent advice they will ask for and is typically like, how do we not get sued? Not how do we sue somebody else, right? It'll be, how do we not get sued? And by the way, I'm not taking any clients now. By the way, I actually work for a startup now, and so I'm not. So if anyone's listening to this, don't come to me with any more. But having said that, how do I not get sued is kind of the most common question. And unfortunately for them, if they come to a patent attorney like me, I'll oftentimes tell them, save your money. Because doing the typical thing they ask you is for like a clearance search, where they tell me to go and do a search on the subject matter they want to do work in. And I'm supposed to go and find all the patents that could possibly be used to sue them if they do this and that, and help them to sort of avoid those patents. I used to do that. I used to charge for that. And you know what? There's no value in it, because there's so many different ways that you can describe a patented thing,
Right.
that, first of all, even to sort of describe specifically what they're going to do is hard enough to find the patents that are applicable.
Right.
And forget about what specifically you're going to do. Anytime you do something, you can get sued for something completely different and trivial that you had no idea you could get
And in
sued
fact,
for.
I mean, that's what usually happens. Is people even say, like, even if they had looked at
podcasting
patents
patent,
they looked at patents in their area, and they never thought that they never even saw the one that they eventually got sued over. And that brings up one other point that I want to make sure that we bring into all this, which is one of the key reasons behind the patent system from the very beginning was the idea that you were supposed to be disclosing these ideas so that eventually, once the patent expires, other people could learn from that. And yet, if you talk to anyone, especially in the software space, you don't learn a damn thing from a patent that
Here's
is
a
out there.
challenge. Has anybody ever heard of an engineer going to the U.S. Patent Office patent papers and looking at the patent to figure out how to do software? Never. Never. You go to GitHub, you go to somewhere where it's actually transparent. Has anyone actually read a software patent? I mean, I write these things. I show them to an inventor, and the inventor comes back to me and they'll be like, this kind of looks like what I invented, but what is all this legalese? Like, I don't even understand it. And that's
the diagrams are usually my favorite part.
Yeah,
There's some good ones, But that's the thing, right? I mean, and somebody made this argument that a patent should be, you should be able to actually read a patent and then from that patent be able to implement what the patent is supposed to be doing.
Right.
And yet, with software patents, it's impossible. They talk about it's very, very broad and general ideas, and they do that on purpose because that's the way that they can sue everybody down the road when somebody actually does something that's sort of kind of maybe if you squint and twist your head can look like that.
I mean, I have a question here in terms of like, you don't have to. So say hypothetically, I were an inventor and I came up with some amazing new novel ways to call it like a battery or something crazy that you could not reverse engineer. right?
You don't
Like,
need to patent.
I don't need
And
to patent
in
it.
fact-
But would I want to patent it? Like I'm like nobody
That's a
can
business
figure it out,
strategy,
right? Like people can you can keep.
Your employees could leave the company.
Yeah, but
right?
true. But so what I'm
Yeah,
saying is like
yeah.
you can still keep a trade secret, right? And like
Yeah.
people do that a lot.
Well,
or-
that's a whole other
Oh, that's a whole
area.
other
You know,
okay.
Trade secrets maybe is another future podcast subject. But yeah, right. And so, but you're exactly right, which is that, you know, with a patent, even with all these other issues, a patent does only last for 20 years from application, right? So after that, anyone can do anything with it. And so, in theory, if you have an idea that is really, you know, super amazing, and that you think you can keep secret, you're, you know, depending on what you're trying to do, generally speaking, people argue that you're better off just keeping it as a trade secret and not filing a patent. There are many, many caveats to that claim.
Sure.
And there are reasons why you might want to push things publicly, and there are...
Or maybe you don't know. I mean, the reason why Facebook worked and Google Plus didn't, like,
It's again,
a lot of
right,
reasons,
you,
right?
you don't
So-
know the
exactly.
the
You don't know.
things, but we are running out of time on this particular one, so let's do final points on why the patent system sucks.
I don't. Yeah, man, you put me in the position. Dennis,
I mean, I'll start. I mean, basically, like as an entrepreneur, like I actually rarely think about patents. Honestly, the last thing you need to be thinking about when you're starting a company is whether or not you're either infringing upon other patents or even if you have patentable things. I think the last time I talked about patents was when lawyers kind of at the end of a startup experience, they're like, hey, let's take a look here if there's anything patentable.
Right.
And in terms of being sued, I think that's one of those problems that if someone's suing you for patent infringement, you're probably doing pretty well. So good job. So
And if you're suing someone with your patents, you know, conversely, you're usually somebody who has not succeeded. I mean, people who are succeeding in the market don't go out there wasting their time trying to sue other people.
So
It just doesn't
I'm going to
happen.
focus my energy on building the company and not kind of worrying about the patent part of it.
Yeah, and so you know, on that, it's definitely true that it's kind of a rite of passage after a startup raises a bunch of venture capital to get sued. But there are cases where you know, patent trolls have definitely, especially more recently, have really started to shake down smaller players. And you know, and we didn't even get into the fact that the reason why, and we'll probably get into this in the next week's podcast, but the reason why so much of this works is that they know that the cost of defending a patent suit is so high. And so they're willing to shake down a company and say, you pay me $10,000 and I'll go away. You do that with enough small companies and it's actually worthwhile.
And it takes a lot of courage to fight the suits in that kind of a situation.
But the more exposure we have to the fights, the better, right? So
But we'll get into that
about
in next week's. But
my last thoughts.
Yeah.
You know, my last thoughts on this is that you know, it's maybe a little bit orthogonal to what we've been talking about, but you know, my opinions on this as a patent attorney are actually not that rare. And the way Masnick makes it sound is that it's really rare. You know what? In private, a lot of patent attorneys who are common sense people who work with engineers who are in the Valley completely agree with me. There's very few people who are going to get on a podcast and talk about it in that way because you're basically you're shitting on your own career, right? And the way I get around that is making it clear to people that, like, look, even though I don't like the system, you know, this is a system we have, and I'll help you navigate it to the best, you know, for you and your shareholders the best we can, you know. So that's the kind of the way I rationalize it. But for a lot of people, it's very difficult to work like that, to basically say, I know the system is broken, and to they feel like they're going to need to justify why they work in the system. Oh, this is a great system. But you know, most of the no-nonsense patent attorneys, in private at least, will basically say, this is so busted. You know, I'm not just talking about litigators. Obviously, litigators might actually have more of an incentive to admit it's busted because they're helping people defend against patent suits. Not just litigators, even prosecutors, people that actually write patents.
yeah.
So there's...
I mean, what I've seen at least, and this is a very broad generalization, so maybe it's not true, but the patent lawyers who were actual engineers before they went into the law, they tend to agree with that. The patent lawyers who never were engineers or never worked in tech before becoming patent lawyers, they tend to defend the system much more strongly. Again, huge generalization, but that's at least my experience.
That could be kind of a fair assessment. But I'm sure you'll find at least some former working engineers.
And there are exceptions to that. It's a very broad thing.
It's so complicated.
Yeah,
Anyway.
but so my just sort of final thoughts on this is that I really think that, the system is incredibly broken. And I think that, you talk to anyone who's actually doing innovative work, especially in software, but increasingly in hardware today too. There's a lot of tech hardware startups that are popping up these days. They're realizing that the patent system does exactly the opposite of what it is supposed to do, which is encouraging innovation. And instead, it's very much hindering innovation and, creating a lot of money for lawyers, but not for innovators. And so that's a problem. And hopefully next week, we're going to solve it, right? We can solve all this in half an hour. Yeah. All right. No problem. Yeah. So, all right. Thanks, guys. And we'll be back next week with part 2 of our patent discussion. Bye.
Don't build anything, they're lifeless, soulless creatures. They glom onto creative folk and suck away like leeches. They're the perfect symbol of our time. Their smell cannot be rancor. They represent our current state along with investment bankers. So destroy, destroy, destroy.